This storm has caused confusion and delay.
You have caused
Confusion and delay.
I think you will face prejudice.
Daisy is just the ultimate farm. Daisy is just the ultimate farm.
Your impatience has caused confusion and delay. This storm has caused confusion and delay. You are causing confusion and delay. He has caused confusion and delay.
26 years old and you can't even drive? I can. Are you stupid, eh? Are you a stupid fool? Well, why can't you drive then? You can't even drive! Bit grey today.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another Deepest Law. I'm here. I'm joined by default friend today, also known as Catherine D. How are you doing, Catherine?
I'm good. I was surprised you invited me on. This isn't my usual kind of program.
Well, I mean, this is a kind of culture show, and I'm kind of intrigued as to what because I followed you for a while, and you describe yourself as a internet historian. I'm kind of intrigued as to what that is and to what internet history is. I've got kind of an idea, but I thought we could get into it. But before we get going here, I have to pay the bills, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to do some shilling, Catherine. I currently have a sale on at the academic agency. You can buy all courses now, 25% off with the promo code Mario Law.
Super Mario Brothers 2は
Game Watch Game Watch Game Watch Game Watch いつでも Game Watch どこでも Game Watch 誰でも Game Watch Game Watch ジャッジボールバーミンファイヤーマイクロコンピューターを使ったゲームウォッチ。ゲームをしないときはデジタル式クォーツ時計です。ゲームウォッチ。
And Catherine, is there anything that you would like to promote before we get going?
No, I think people know where to find me.
I mean, just in case anybody doesn't know, where's the best place? Is it on Twitter? Is it your Substack? Where should people go?
Yeah, I think my Substack probably does a better job at describing what I'm all about. And it's just defaultfriend.substack.com.
And so internet history then, what is it? What is an internet historian? And what is it that you kind of do? Because I grew up watching Seinfeld in the 90s. It's a show about nothing. And I've sometimes thought, is that what you're? Are you a feed about nothing? Do explain.
Yeah, my Twitter presence is probably a little bit confusing, but I think I make more sense when people look at my long form work. There's more of a through line there. So internet history it's a real discipline. I didn't make it up. It's sort of under the broader umbrella of internet studies, which is it's a field that's sort of struggled to define itself. Is it history? Is it anthropology? Is it something else? And everyone who is part of this field sort of has a different definition for it, because it's not new. It's actually it's over 30 years old, but there's just been a lot of debate about what its purpose is and if people should take it seriously. What I do is I pick moments in time, specifically like digitally anchored ones, and I look through archives and I interview people and I try to put together a story. Because things get lost really quickly online. It could be difficult to keep a good record of what happened, and it's also been diminished a lot. People think it's very juvenile, very childish or unimportant, but obviously, right, looking at the world we live in now, what happens online influences the physical world, and some could even argue that the line between physical and digital has really blurred.
Yeah, I remember being attacked quite a bit when I made a video and I said Twitter is real life. um, but I'm sure you understand what I mean by that, right? That you know, it's increasingly the sorts of stuff you see on Twitter, you then see reflected in the actual real world, and it's hard to say which way around which way around is what's driving what, right? In terms of internet history, obviously the internet is not that old. When did the when did the I mean, I'm old enough to remember when they talked about the information superhighway, and there were people on television and they say things like, if you'd like to follow our website, go to www.bbc.co.uk, or whatever the website happened to be. um where does internet history start, roughly speaking?
And so the internet is sort of old. I mean, it depends on what you mean by old, right? It's under 100 years old, but it's been with us for a while. Where the kind of work I do starts is in the 90s, but there's other people who are going back, much further, even like the late 60s. Um, I focus on social trends, so like I look at like Usenet archives quite a bit. I'd say what the kind like the earliest I'm really looking at is like 1994. But that doesn't mean that's the whole, that's where it begins for everyone.
Before a certain date, I mean, I'm not an internet historian, so I only have a very hazy idea of these things. But was it something like CompuServe or something like that, where it's mainly kind of techies messaging each other, and it's more just kind of text on a page. You wouldn't get images and things like that in the very very early internet, the pre 1994 one. I have a kind of idea that the internet only really became a thing that normal people would use, like say my parents or me, for example, round about the mid 90s. That's fair to say.
I think, yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, that's when it starts becoming commercialized. The commercial internet is where you start seeing like droves of people logging on. Early it's government employees, it's people in academia, and then Bay Area techno utopians, and the barrier of entry was just too high. So it was really niche. But over time, the population grew. More people migrated online. The big migration, the big explosion happens around 2010, when social media really takes off. And then it's no surprise that 3 years later, right in 2013, the physical world culture sees some very massive changes in how we speak and how we view ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, why don't we go? So I would say then, in this little timeline that you've outlined here, there's the kind of early internet, by which we mean the 90s and 2000s, I guess. Or I mean, I would probably make a distinction between, because I remember when we first got the internet, it came on a CD. It didn't come on a CD. My parents subscribed to AOL, and it came through the letterbox as a CD, right? I don't know what the CD was for, but when you went on the internet, quote unquote, it just kind of sent you to the AOL. There was like an AOL front page, and it was quite difficult to actually break outside of that. You kind of, I remember a distinct point where the internet went from being that to being like Google homepage, if that makes any sense. Do you have any insight on that? Because I seem to remember that the service providers would be a lot bigger on kind of locking you into their kind of stuff in the early days.
AOL was pretty unique, right? You could have explored gone on another browser like Internet Explorer or Netscape, which Mark Andreessen founded. But yeah, I mean, I miss AOL. I think things were a lot better then because it was a bundle. You had email, you had the instant messenger, you had the browser. It curated your news for you, but breaking out and unbundling that had been available, and it was still available. I think AOL just made it easier for people.
Right.
Because it was just much more streamlined, and it lowered the barrier to entry a lot. Like you didn't have to figure out how to set up your email, which could have, sometimes was not complicated, but if you weren't very tech savvy, it could be a little bit intimidating. You didn't have to figure out how to use instant messaging. It was all there for you.
I remember going on those. I mean, I was pretty young at the time, like maybe 15 or something like that. But going on AOL chat rooms in that era, and there could only be 23 people in there at a time. And I used to hang out in the UK-US transatlantic one, but if it overflowed, it would create number 2 and number 3 and number 4. And I just generally chat in there, generally to like 40-year-old women called Jane and things like that. But
I loved AOL chat rooms. I spent a lot of time in them also. I mostly did text-based role playing. So it was in the tavern, I think, was one of them. And then like later on, there was like a Harry Potter themed one. I mean, I think I must have spent like all of like 2000 and 2001 in
AOL chat. Do you reckon me and you ever talked in AOL chat?
I mean, that'd be wild, right?
There were some odd. I mean, just while we're on this early period, there were some odd things about those chat rooms, like which weirdly I see get reborn. You know, like how on Twitter now, everybody does the GM post, the good morning posts, right?
Right.
Well, I remember that on those AOL chat rooms when there was such a thing as a regular, right? Like Jane from Harlow, whatever her name was. There were people who'd go in there all the time, and there'd be like kind of little set rituals for how they'd be greeted and given little hugs, and there was this whole thing. You mentioned the tavern. There was this whole thing of like, oh, I'll get you a drink, but it's just like, it was just somebody writing, "I've gotten you a drink," as opposed to an actual physical drink. Obviously,
this is a really weird thing that you see in the early internet, which is this. Even if you're not explicitly role playing, text-based role plays were super popular. But even if you weren't, there was this like attempt to simulate physical interaction that I think that's mostly been lost. So you do see like asterisk, hands you a drink, asterisk. Another feature of that was, just believing people, right? Like it wasn't that you didn't think that people could lie to you, but there is a very different relationship with deception. So if someone like self-identified as a sexy redhead, like you would just believe that. And I think that's you kind of see that a little bit now. But it was really interesting. You just take people at their word.
Yeah, I mean, I never once questioned that Jane from Harlow. I mean, I never once thought, oh, Jane from Harlow is probably the bloke sitting there and he's like scratching his balls or whatever. I genuinely thought, and look, it probably was as well, because people were a bit more, I guess, naive in those. Like this is something that's come up recently, actually, with all of the stuff around anons, right? Oh, you're a coward because you don't use your own name. But I remember very early on in the internet using my own name and then thinking, hold on, my name is pretty unusual, pretty easy to search it, right? And at some point there was a transition over from, those chat rooms and the kind of early AOL to, I mean, in the way I use the internet forums, right? where there'd be posters, and it was just the done thing. You'd upload an avatar, and nobody used their real name on those forums. Nobody. It was just the kind of, I say you're a member of, I don't know, 5 or 6, 10 different forums. I might have a different name on every single one of them.
Oh, yeah. And that was recommended so people couldn't track you across websites. I mean, what's really interesting is like I don't know if maybe I just said it was like a naivete, but it's weird because you also have that like New Yorker cartoon on the internet, Nobody Knows You're a Dog. It's almost like a self-conscious sort of role play or something, because like you did sort of assume people were lying, but then you also believed them. I don't know. It's a very strange contradiction. But yeah, I remember I was very hesitant to use my name for a very long time, and I still don't use my name, right? But I remember when people started using their real name to like write on their blogs, and this was like very trendy to do in the early 2010s, maybe a little bit earlier. I thought that was so like rebellious and kind of edgy because I didn't even use my real name on Facebook. I was going by like Laird Hen or something for for like 5 or 6 years.
Yeah. So I'm trying to remember now, because definitely by the early 2000s, those forums were a thing. And my chief way of using the internet really was, you might look up some news, right? You can look up some information about certain things, but I have a lot of interests and hobbies and things like that, and there would be a forum, a specialist forum for each one of those things, be it video games or I was into pro wrestling, as somebody else might be into trains. I imagine women have other interests, but there would be a forum for every type, and there was a kind of weird hierarchy on those forums where the two things that singled a person out were their join date and their number of posts. Do you remember that? So you could really establish yourself on a forum, if you had like an OG join date and lots of posts. That wasn't necessarily frowned on, that you were spending like too much time on there. It kind of bought you kudos or whatever. And those people would be the regulars and the kind of core of the forum and of that community. And then other people may come and go. There could have been like quieter people or whatever. But I remember that no matter what the type of forum it was, whether it was video games or wrestling or whatever else, there would always be a pinned thread at the top of the forum, which was called something like the bar or the tavern or the pub, which would be exclusively people checking in and saying good morning to each other, how you doing, and giving each other hugs. And back in those days, when you put a lot of brackets around someone's name, that was giving them a hug. Has different connotations now, but right. I mean, do you remember any of that? Am I making this up?
Oh yeah, no, that's real. I really miss forum culture. It was a nice bridge between, I guess, like news groups, and then chat rooms were more popular, and then forums were the most popular way to communicate with people. There's a nice culture because you had to get to know the etiquette. There was a finite population. It didn't feel so open. There's still a lot of drama, and there's some like really great writing about forum drama.
As you can imagine, Catherine, I was involved in a lot of forum drama in my time, and probably banned from a good few as well. What sort of things do people talk about forum drama out of interest?
There's a really good essay by this woman who went by Humdog, who I read a lot about her on my Substack, and I just wrote a review of her collected writing for the New Atlantis. She wrote a piece called "History of the Board Hoe," and it was basically about how on every forum there are these divas that have like a clique of catty people around them, and they're what makes the forum exciting. They drive the forum. They create the excitement, which brings other people in. And I think that's true on Twitter too. And it seems so obvious reading it now, but then it was crazy because you thought about it like, oh, these are just people online. There's no sort of social hierarchy here. It's not. There's no business underlying it.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting as well, though, because I wonder, like, obviously, you and I mean, I have never used the word influencer, right? But I'm somebody who has a lot of followers on both Twitter and even more here on YouTube. And it's never really occurred to me before, like, for all those years I was on forums and things, was I just gaining XP? It's like, by the time we hit Twitter, were we just super experienced, just know how to, like, make a bit of a splash and gain loyal followers? And I mean, I tell you something else that happened a lot as well, is that in the aftermath of a drama, somebody might actually create a new forum, and there was a split in the forum, and that person would go off, and a new community was born, like around the split. Did you ever see that happen? I seem to remember that happened like 4 or 5 times.
Yeah, that happened that did happen all the time. I spent a lot of time on role-playing forums. So it was like play by post, and there would be like endless drama on that, because it's really what it is a collaborative story, right? It's not quite a game. It's somewhere in between a game and an attempt to write literature, really. And that there would always be schisms, and it would be, let's say the role play was like Regency era England, like, so, there would be a big fight, and then like another one would like respawn, and like everyone like moved, scare quotes, to France. It was like very, very weird dynamic.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think back to my embarrassment. My co-host on Unpopular Opinions, who's also called D, but a different D, found an old forum post I'd made. I let slip what one of my names was, and they dredged up this post I'd made back in 2008, where I was saying that I was really excited about Barack Obama becoming the president. So I was exposed as being a shitlib in 2008, essentially. But I'm just trying to think of some other things, though, because I don't remember. I remember memes being a thing on the. I mean, I made the cover for the show, and it was like the dancing. There was a peanut butter jelly time, and all your base belonged to us, and so on. But on the forums I went on, I remember them being like pretty strict, and they'd be like no meat, like they'd have rules against posting too many images, or I mean, a huge thing was like going off topic, because there'd be, in the hierarchy, there was a moderator at the top, the admin, then below them a whole team of moderators, right? And certainly the better boards had like pretty strict, like you have to stay on topic, and people would be banned for like going off topic in various forums that I was on. And I don't remember memes being a great part of those. So I'm like, where were, maybe I was on the wrong forum, but where did the memes come from in that internet of the early 2000s?
Well, so memes have been around for a very long time. I think they become more popular as image boards become more popular, which move much, much more quickly. The thing with forums were, first of all, I mean, it would just muck up the discussion, and it'd be like very unruly to read, because you have these like, conversations that are hundreds of pages long. And if you have someone who's posting, if you're posting images and you're on dial-up, it depends on how far back you're going. Yeah. Or, if you don't have the bandwidth to download them, it causes a huge, it's just a logistics problem. But it also makes it difficult to navigate these discussions. Sometimes people are posting like, 400 or 500 word responses. It just doesn't make sense. But on image boards, where it's moving much quicker, images start to make more sense as a form of communication.
Mm. Yeah, that's a very good point, actually, about both the speed of the internet. But yeah, I mean, certainly the forums I went on, it was just bad etiquette. and it would be flagged up as they'd just say stop spamming or stop going off topic or whatever, and it would probably be deleted. And the guy, if he kept on doing it, would be banned. Now, I never went on, and still to this day, I have never been able to get on with any of the image boards. I've never been on 4chan. I've never been on any of the derivatives of 4chan. I just don't get it. I just don't, like, to me, as someone who came from that world of forums, right, I just couldn't make sense of what was going on. Like, I still, when I look at 4chan, it looks like just a mess to me, and I can't navigate my way around it. So, did you spend any time on those boards?
I wasn't much of a 4chan person, and I that's obviously a product of being like a preteen girl when it was coming up. It wasn't necessarily safe for me, but I've used other image boards. The image boards I use are much slower than 4chan, and the types of discussions that they host are better, are better left anonymous, right? You don't really want a persistent identity if you are catching up on like some like arcane drama about a random beauty influencer, which is another huge use case for image boards. Sometimes it's it doesn't have to be that. But a lot of the female focused image boards are really for gossip. It's like writing on the bathroom wall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing I just didn't get about the image boards, is that if it's all anonymous, like, there's a difference between having a pseudonym and just being like truly anonymous, i.e. it's just there's no name there. And maybe it's just like a kind of how can I, like a narcissism thing or something. But to me, it's like, well, you can't build any following up there. You can't build up a kind of you can't build up a character or anything, because you're just anonymous. So
well, you sort of can. It's just not. It just doesn't belong to you in the same way. There's definitely archetypes that emerge on image boards, and I read an interesting. I wish I remember who wrote it, but I read an interesting paper about this recently, about the different archetypes that emerge on like women-focused image boards. But yeah, it's more like a hive, right? And it's not about building a following. It's not about that persistent identity. It's more about having conversations that you feel like you can't have honestly, or expressing something that you can't express honestly if it can be tied back to you.
Right. So now I'm being
rules and etiquette, right?
Now I'm being accused of being an attention whore. It's all coming back to me now. Okay, just while we're on that early internet, I remember Facebook. I was just finishing up my master's when I got my Facebook account back in 2006, I think I was. That's when I joined Facebook. That would have been the first social media site that I was part of. And I think back then, correct me if I'm wrong, it was only open to people who were students or part of a university. Is that right?
Right. Early on, you needed a .edu email address to be on Facebook, and then they expanded it. A funny loophole with that is, I think I was in middle school when Facebook was first on my radar, and I went to a private school that gave everyone email addresses. So I felt so cool that I could be on this website that was just for college students.
Yeah, there was a kind of like an elite. There was an elite part that seems bizarre to think of now, right? But at one point, Facebook was kind of an elite thing because not everybody could have it. But to me, as somebody who always liked to keep my online life and my real life rather separate, Facebook was much more real life than internet, because it would be all people you knew in real life, right? And in my mind, it still is. I don't actually use Facebook anymore, but all of the people I'm friends with on there are my real friends from school or from college or family members or whatever else. And I've never quite understood trying to use Facebook as a mass platform, because to me it's just a small. It's the sort of thing where you post your holiday snaps, or you know.
It used to be more like culturally, it used to be more similar to Twitter, which I think is really interesting. People would use Facebook groups, and there would be Twitter anons. I'm not Twitter anons, Facebook anons, and there were people who would use their real name, but it felt kind of edgy because all these cancellation mobs that we've seen the past, I don't know, decade on Twitter. Like that would happen on Facebook too. You post something too controversial under your legal name in a Facebook group where you're discussing some like esoteric politics, and it would completely derail your life. I remember I would always like dance as close to the flame as I could before like try to tempt the mob.
What year was this? Would you say that was happening?
That was happening until I would say like peak was like 2011, and then it petered off around 2018.
Interesting. I mean, there's a few other things to mention with Facebook, because my Facebook feed, if I follow its history from 2006 to now, at one point it was just people going out in clubs, right? And then it was and then I mean, just the photos that come up, right? And then at some point, it just kind of follows the age, the kind of age trajectory of the people right? So then at another point, the going out in the club pictures stopped, and it was, I'm getting into running marathons, and and now it's just like endless baby photos. That's all it is. The other weird thing that happened with Facebook is that I remember a distinct moment when my parents joined, and everybody's parents joined Facebook. So there was a great I don't know if this has got like a name in your internet history, but it's like the kind of boomerization of Facebook. It was like suddenly it went from something that just us students were using to like now your aunt and your uncle and your mum and dad and everybody's on there. Anything to say about that?
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. There's people who like their whole work is tracking these migrations, these digital migrations, and it happens to a lot of platforms. Like there's the illusion that the platform has died, but the demographics have just changed. Sometimes these do kill platforms. Like the famous example is MySpace. MySpace wound down. But yeah, with Facebook's interesting because the demographics changed, but it didn't kill it. It just feels dead because it's this sort of invisible user base. People don't really think of older people using social media, but they really do. People, everyone really is online. There is no age bracket that isn't, they might not be internet poisoned, but they certainly are using social platforms.
Yeah, there's something else about the early Facebook I'm just remembering now, which was that I don't know if those I don't know if they're still there, but certainly around the time I joined back in 2006, there were all these different categories that just because you were there, you kind of felt compelled to fill them out. There was like, what's your favorite music? What are your favorite films? What are and if you're anything like me, I'm a kind of guy who makes a top 100 list of albums or top. So there was a lot more of that sort of stuff as well, where just the very fact that those things were there meant that people were a lot of the time like recommending stuff or talking about those sorts of things. But I remember a distinct moment in this country. It was around Brexit. Probably in America, it was around Trump, right? Where suddenly my feed stopped being like normie stuff, and people started opining on political issues, right? And this reached a kind of fever pitch around Brexit. and then there was a distinct moment where it felt like basically everyone had had enough of like politics talk on Facebook. So basically, just nobody uses it. Like nobody posts anything. So my feed and my friends and me, I just say everybody stopped using Facebook around 2017 for anything apart from the very occasional like family snap or something. I just don't see anything on there. Nobody talks at all. The idea of doing a status is just gone. It just doesn't exist anymore. Am I wrong?
Well, I don't really use it myself either. I think I stopped using it, yeah, maybe around that time. But I also became more interested in other platforms then. I became less fearful of having a like persistent internet identity, and I'd always had like internet friends, but I was like very sort of small minded about it. Like I never, I always had like 40 followers on Twitter and in like 10-person large Discord servers. I was much more private than I am now. And then I started being like more digitally outgoing, and that's around the time I stopped using Facebook. But people still use Facebook. It's just for, like I said, for different. It serves different purposes, like events, because there's really been no other platform to get this right. Like if you're someone who goes to a lot of like art galleries or is interested in the performing arts or something, Facebook is great for events or like inviting people to parties, things like that. Like basically people who aren't on more global platforms, so to speak. It's also really good for like weird, like niche interests. So like one Facebook group that I've been watching, it doesn't describe my experience, I just think it's really interesting, is like people who have these like crypto pregnancies, which is like they've imagined that they're pregnant and they think that doctors don't recognize it. And sometimes they like nurse these fake pregnancies for like years and years and years. It's a very strange phenomenon. But like those groups are so active on Facebook. Women in the Midwest who like reverted to Islam is another like demographic. All these like niche things where they're like kind of private, you benefit from a closed group, and maybe like you aren't necessarily super online, but you are super eccentric. Facebook seems to still be booming for that.
Interesting, yeah. I mean, maybe it's just I don't go on there. I just assume that nothing happens, but maybe it's still, there's still pockets of stuff going on. A lot of those groups are private, though, right? You can't actually see them unless you're part of them. Is that right?
You have to look. You have to look for them. I think like older people, like we said, are still using Facebook for all the traditional reasons that people used Facebook back in the day.
Yeah, I'm just looking at my feed now to see what's on there. It's somebody posted a picture of their pint. Yeah, I mean, in my mind, Facebook is inward facing and Twitter is outward facing. If that makes any sense. Although I guess you can have a public profile on there, like a second is that possible? Where you'd have your personal account, but then you've got an account that is for something bigger, or would you make a group?
You'd probably make a page at this point. So people, like small businesses have this. Yeah, but I agree with you. Facebook at this point is sort of more private. The days of people trying to flex their influencer status on Facebook, where like they would hit their max of 5,000 friends and then have a bunch of followers, seems to be over.
Yeah, I'm even looking at Carl Benjamin now, who's a very well-known guy who I'm Facebook friends with, and I thought that he might be someone who uses Facebook in that way, but actually no, he has only 288 friends, one of which is me. So I have met him in real life, so he kind of counts. Just before we move on to kind of current internet and various other trends, one of the things that with the big move to social media, which I actually think took a lot longer than people think. We remember you said like 2010 is a kind of turning point. Is that the moment where suddenly the internet was not a place where you went from the TV or from somewhere else, but suddenly became like everybody was on there? It's like there's not anybody who's not online anymore after 2010. Why is 2010 significant in the internet history?
That's when Facebook really opens up, and there's more diversity of users after that point. I would say 2013 is like the big year, and there's all there's the world of apps is booming. WhatsApp is like peak popularity in 2013. Well, maybe not peak popularity, but that's a huge year for WhatsApp. More and more people have smartphones. I would say around 2013, basically everyone has a smartphone at this point. And a huge thing is like you have this shift from desktop computers to laptops to smartphones, and that changes people's relationship with the internet a lot too. Like the death of the computer room is very significant.
Yes, because you had to go to your computer to go on the internet. Now, of course, you have it wherever you go. I mean, I've actually experimented with just leaving my phone and not having it. It's actually amazingly liberating, not having your
It is.
smartphone on you. Just like suddenly I'm in the real world again. But I remember the emergence of social media really having a big impact on those internet forums we were talking about. This especially happened. I remember that this was around 2016. I saw a very well-established wrestling forum that I was a part of, which had a really good community, was super active. Basically, people started like going on Twitter and discussing things on Twitter. And that not only destroyed the forum, but it completely destroyed the sorts of discussions that used to go on. And this is something I find interesting because that forum I used to go on was super in depth, super critical. They were kind of, they prided themselves on being like the top 1% of people who analyze this stuff. And when that same group of people then got onto Twitter, it became a very different economy of like harvesting likes, and all of a sudden it was like you couldn't criticize anything anymore. It was almost like you had to like everything now, which was super weird to see in the space of like a year or so. Is that something that happens, or is that just unique to my experience?
No, I think that's a good characterization. On forums, right? There's so many things that go into it. There's a more established hierarchy. It's much smaller. It's more likely because there's like a finite number of topics that are being discussed. It's people who are really interested. And I mean, this is true for even like physical world hobbies. Like the character of like a puppeteering meetup group is going to be very different than like something that is a little bit more accessible, where people might be there for more of a social element than the actual thing, right? And then you have this added issue where at first, people are, like you said, harvesting likes, and so the economy is changing. And then once people realize that not only can they be popular and collect social capital, that social capital could translate to physical world capital, whether in the form of important people paying attention to them or money, that really changes the dynamics. You see this in almost every community, where it's like, it starts off with like a core group of nerds, and then the drama is very intelligible, and it's like the same kind of drama you'd see in like I said, like in any like physical world meetup. And then it's about, like I said, like popularity, and then the drama kind of changes. And then once you introduce financial competition, that is what completely nukes the scene. And there'll be pockets of people who really care and who are really about, whatever the thing is. But it's more like the quick turnover on takes, that, you know, people constantly getting ousted, all of these schisms. It's so bloodthirsty because people know that they're commanding an audience and they're competing for other people's audiences. And if they're not super original, right, and like they don't really know what purpose they serve, they just want to be a thought leader of some kind, it's going to get really bloody out there. I mean, I think that explains Twitter pretty well, and also why there's constantly like podcasters against Substackers, and then there's like an economy of like who owns the anons, right? There's all sorts of interesting things that happen there.
Let's go through some of them. What is the podcasters versus the Substackers?
I found, I mean, this isn't super interesting, but I found that like there's this thing where like podcasters love to, post sort of like derisive things about Substackers as though there's any like meaningful difference between someone who is charging for a Substack and who has a Patreon for their podcast. I mean, really what it is like it's like my sports team is better than your sports team.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to think. I mean, I've been a podcaster and a Substacker in my time. I definitely think that the business model of Substack is better than I've got a podcast and donate to my Patreon. I always thought that I mean, I also think that the YouTube channel memberships are better than the Patreon as well. I never liked the donate to me idea, because I feel like you're giving it away for free and now you want people to pay. Whereas if it's a channel membership, or if it's a Substack with locked posts, right, it's much more like buying a sandwich at a shop. Like you're giving money in exchange for a service, right? Whereas the donate thing always has this kind of weird like charity thing involved with it. I never liked it. I don't know what your views are on that, but
I think there's something about Patreon's branding. I do think it works. The way it works isn't super different than Substack, right? Like the platform's taking a cut. You offer some things for free to like lure people in, and with the hopes that they think whatever's paywalled is better. I don't think it's just like generalized support necessarily. And people certainly use Substack as a form of like generalized support. That's actually how I use it. Just in case someone wants to pay me, they're welcome to, but no pressure, right? I'm not big on the paywalled content. But yeah, I'm with you that there's something about like the vibe of Patreon that is a little bit off-putting.
Yeah, there are. I think I still have some Patreon. I don't even post it, but there are still people who give me Patreon every month, who must have been doing it for years at this point. I don't even know my Patreon login. Well, like, why do those guys give me money on there? I just don't get it. But anyway, I'm not complaining or anything, but like, you might as well get the thing where you get the thousands of shows in the back archive or whatever. Anyway,
it's interesting though, because I think you do bring up a good point. There's something about, even though there isn't a real difference, there's something about Substack that feels like you're using, like, to me, Substack feels more like Etsy, right? Where it's like I have a storefront, for lack of a better word, and I'm just using Substack as the processing system. But even though Patreon actually is doing the same thing, for some reason, it just feels different. And I think it freaks some people, freaks both of us out a little bit.
Yeah, I think that the phrase is e-begging, right? And I'm not a beggar. I'm a someone who sells a service or I don't know. I'm just you don't want to feel like you're begging, right? Or that people are doing it for charity. They're doing it because they, in exactly the same way you'd give money to Netflix, right? You'd never think, well, Netflix are begging for money.
There's an interesting perception thing, because I think a lot of people view, and this is, like kind of a gross phrase, but view content creators as essentially beggars, like their product doesn't have very much value, even if that person has a lot of followers or something. They're just not taken seriously. And I don't really know why that is. I don't know if it's because there is a lot of just like terrible content, or it's just anyone could throw up a Substack or a Patreon or whatever. But it's not as much as, you know, like people like us do have a lot of like diehard fans and do have an audience. It's not really a respected, I can't even say profession, because I've said profession and people are like, well, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I've never quite understood that. Like a word that gets flung around a lot in these spheres is grifter. But I mean,
Oh yeah.
do you, like, nobody calls the guy in the store who sells them a sandwich a grifter? It's just somebody who's selling them a sandwich. So I don't know, like,
It's hard to define grifter too. I mean, I do think there are people who are grifting, and part of that is an insincerity. But I've also noticed that people are very difficult at pinning down who is and isn't insincere, and like what is insincerity and what is sort of the craft of marketing yourself that's necessary to keep making money. And it really turns, it boils down to like a likability thing most of the time.
I mean, it's especially difficult for someone like me who is incapable of being sincere, right? Due to my Xennial Daria roots. Even when I'm trying to be nice, people think I'm being sarcastic. So, but I think that's a different, we're talking about a different thing though, right? We're talking about grifting, like people saying stuff that they don't really believe because they think it will get them more clicks and likes and sell them more mugs or something like that. That would be like classic grifting.
Yeah, I mean, I do think you see something, and this is like very common, especially on people who use Twitter as their main platform, where the locus of energy will change, right? Like sometimes, like right now, it's in politics in general, and that's sort of that's winding down. But you know, maybe a decade ago, the big bucks were really on the left, especially in the United States. That's where you were going to get the most people who are willing to pay. And then it shifted to the right. And so you see people sort of, coyly evolve their politics and say, oh, well, that person's grifting because they want to capture the energy of whatever movement is popular right now. No, of course, no one ever gives them benefit. Maybe their opinions really did change. Maybe, what's the causality there? But I think that when people talk about grifting, I think that's really what they are talking about, people who see energy and try to extract it.
I've never really understood the idea of people paying left-wing content creators because they just have the media. Like, why don't just watch CNN? What are they offering that's different?
Probably a parasocial relationship. Feeling that people are also paying for less the content and more the person who is saying it. They're paying for the person.
Yeah. That's another very strange thing where lots of people probably have a power social relationship with me, and I've never met them, but they feel like they know me because they listen to hours of me talking like this. I've never really kind of strange thing, isn't it? I remember this guy I was out shopping once, and this guy like came over and he's like, "Are you the academic agent?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm also in a shop," and I didn't know what to say. So I do find that a very strange thing. But I have also found, like, going to events and things like that when you meet people in real life, they become more real in a way. I mean, also talking to them on a show like this, like me and you having talked now, I feel like I know you a bit better than I did before. But actually meeting someone in real life, to me, is still where that person goes from being like an online person to like a real person. Would you agree with that? Because
Yeah,
I've noticed that you do something that I find a little bit odd. And I'm not saying that in a judgy way, but I noticed that you like sometimes say, "Oh, you met somebody for coffee," just off Twitter. Like, are they your friends, or are they like randos on Twitter that you're meeting?
I mean, sometimes they're friends. They're not. We don't always get along, or there's not always chemistry. But I think I'm also unique in that I'm very able to feel like I've connected with someone, even in like a purely mediated relationship. I don't know why that is. I actually like prefer it almost. But I do agree that meeting people in person really changes things. I recently went to an event, I guess in January, so not too recently.
Mhm.
I went to this event that was just full of Twitter people, and I was just struck with like even people who I have like online like kind of hostile relationships with. I was just like struck by like, everyone is like likable and like brings something to the table. I mean, as cliche, kind of corny as that sounds,
Mhm.
I was just like so like pleasantly surprised by like how much nicer it is.
Yeah,
in
everybody's nicer, right? In real life. Yeah.
Everybody's nicer, but also like even if those people didn't even necessarily want to talk to me or like retained their negative opinion based on my Twitter presence, I was
Mhm.
just like they like I just can't dislike them anymore because I'm seeing them as people. I mean, it sounds so obvious, but it's you forget if you're online too much.
Yeah, and you see, the thing I struggle with though is that because I always had this very hard distinction between real life person and online, or real life online, and those things have increasingly blurred over time. Especially now, as because I do this full time. I mean, you know, this also has to be part of real life in some way, right? But I still like I have like all these conceptions of that, like the idea that you would be going to meet someone off Twitter for coffee. My first thought is like, well, is that safe? Like, what if it's a psycho? Do you take someone with you, or how how do you get over that, like the trepidation that this person could like, just be a nutter or something?
I mean, people could be crazy in any number of situations, right? I don't know. I just go by vibe, I guess. I've definitely like been too trusting in the
Yeah.
past, but I don't know. I just if I get a bad feeling, I guess I leave. A good rule of thumb is to meet people in public. Uh, but yeah, maybe I mean, I think you bring up a good point. I'm not as careful as I should be. I definitely am
You
too
should take a
open.
chaperone. You should take Giant Geo as a bodyguard or something. um,
Yeah,
yeah.
sometimes yeah, my significant other doesn't like that I'm so willing to meet Twitter randos or really any kind of Substack randos, email randos.
Um, all right, but now you mentioned another. It was podcasters versus Substackers. What was the other conflict that you mentioned earlier on? I'm trying to
I don't
remember
know.
now.
I was just rattling off different different arguments I see recur online.
So, um, okay, so we had the big change from the forums to the social media, but now it feels like the real world has, in some way, absorbed the internet. Do you think that's fair to say, or do you think that there's still some distinction there between, to go back to Twitter is real life or whatever? How much is there still a distinction between the online um, and the real world? Because it seems to me that most people now consume their news through the internet. If they want to go shopping, they'll probably just go on Amazon. Increasingly, I think, especially since COVID, you might want to get a meal delivered, like something like Deliveroo or whatever other services there are, Urban Eats or whatever. You could book a cab online. I mean, there's basically nothing. There's nothing that you can't do now that isn't on stuff that people used to do routinely in real life. They can now do online, and the basic expectation is that somebody will have that will be available as opposed to not. And if a restaurant didn't have a website, for example, or wasn't on TripAdvisor, you'd wonder why, right? I mean, am I wrong?
I think you're right. One of the big differences is that the internet sort of like a veil over everything we do. Whereas before, like we were talking about, you would log on and off. Right now, there is no logging on. There's paying more and less attention to a screen, but always it's always on. Everyone is always online, even if they're not very online. And so that really blurs the distinction. And even people who you originally met in real life or like family, uh, most people's relationships with these people are mostly mediated. And when you really think about it, it's like, is there a meaningful difference between someone who I met once at an event, or like who I worked with 6 years ago, and is still very much part of my life, but we only talk via iMessage, and someone who I've only spoken to like on Telegram or Signal or Twitter or whatever. Of course, there's some differences, but when you get down to it, it's a lot more unstable and a lot blurrier than you might assume. Where like it's hard for, like, I have internet friends who I'm very, very close with and who like I'll like FaceTime with all the time. And I'm like, I don't really know what the difference is between someone who I've banked, I don't know, 600 hours FaceTiming with, but I've never met in person. And then like another woman who I like the example I gave, like I worked with 6 years ago, and now I just talk to her over text because I live in Chicago and she lives in San Francisco.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I've definitely met people in real life who I spent hours talking to on podcasts or on streams like this, where it's just seamless. It's just like, well, I already know this person. It's just now I'm actually in the same room with them. In fact, that's much more common than people might realize. But I was thinking, like, because I notice a lot of your work on your Substack tends to look at some of the kind of social and personal consequences of people being, should we say, overly online. And this, I've just been on a stag do, which I'm sure you're aware of, because I have a dim memory at like 3 a.m. of you telling me to delete something, which I shouldn't have posted, right? Because I was horrendously drunk. But I was there with a group of 40-year-old lads, or people around my age. I'm 40, and they were around, let's say, I don't know, 35 to 42 would be the age range. And there were a number of things that I witnessed on that trip that kind of brought this home to me. One is that we went to this beach club. We spent all day at this beach club, sitting around having drinks, and frankly, looking at girls in bikinis. And when we arrived, there were groups of young women who had gone to this pool, this beach club, if you can imagine, dressed to the nines. They were wearing like high heels. They were dressed as if they were kind of going to a movie premiere or something, right? And they had gone there purely to take selfies and Instagram shots of themselves by this pool. I'd never seen that before. That was just like a kind of, the entire activity that these girls were involved with was a kind of social media one, but they were also there in real life. And this prompted several of the guys I was with to start talking about it, which is always interesting because, these are quote unquote normies, right? Not like internet people, or people not into politics and culture like we might be, or I might be. And they were saying, we definitely grew up in a better time without social media. Basically everybody agreed that things would be better for kids now if they didn't have the constant social media presence, because it affects their behavior in all sorts of negative ways. The other thing I saw was I was in a nightclub maybe later that night, and I was sitting down having a vodka or whatever I was doing, and I noticed that there were lots of young girls there, right? And young girls in a place like that, they're only there for one reason, really. I mean, they're dancing and having fun, but they're also on the lookout. And all my buddies were there, dancing and getting into it. And a group of young lads came in, all Zoomers, and they sat down. This is in a club in Magaluf. And all 5 of them were just sitting on their phones in the middle of this club at like 1 a.m. What are you even doing here? And so those 2 examples just made me think, like, has the internet just destroyed this generation of kids who just seem to not know how to behave in places, don't know anything, etc. Discuss.
I don't think it's just the internet. I mean, the internet's definitely a big component of it, but our lives are just less social in general. And you have to think about it. Like, you probably grew up in an environment where like people would just show up at your house, and like of course they're friends, not just random people. Um, and you were like interacting with people more. Like, we've become increasingly like more insular. Like, neighbors don't come over for a cup of coffee or whatever anymore. I was in Ireland for a little while, and I was so struck. Like, the big difference between Ireland and where I had grown up was like people just coming to say hello and just having like local friends. And I would imagine that just like most of the West, that really isn't common. So when you're in a busier social scene, it gets overwhelming, especially if you're used to just mediated communication. I can't imagine like feeling comfortable. It can be overwhelming if you are used to it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It is weird though to see that sort of thing in action. I mean, what are some of the other impacts? Because another thing that I noticed that you've talked about before, and somebody actually posted it in live chat. They said, "Is the internet just porn?" What about that talking point? Because I've noticed you've got some articles where you discuss this too.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different angles on porn. It's not all porn, but I think ordinary things become porn because we're so desensitized to explicit sexual imagery it's not that sexual energy is gone. It's that it gets channeled into these weird things. Like, there's I don't know, maybe a couple of years ago, there was all these like very weird cooking videos that were like just oddly sensual. And
Yes.
my theory was like, that is a sexual impulse. It hasn't gone away, but we've fried our brains so much on the obviously sexual that now it's being channeled into something else. The way a lot of like American progressives talked about getting the vaccine, of course, that's like, that's political fandom and that's rooting for the right sports team, so to speak. But it's also like something kind of sexual about that because you're feeling it in your body. Symbolically, there's something sort of sexual about it. It just feels, and this is maybe one of my weirder theories and one that I've got a lot of pushback on. But in a sex recession, and then you have all this weird, these like weirdly erotic, ordinary images. It does seem like there is kind of like a shifting going on.
There's some weird stuff that goes on, in the sorts of stuff that I see. Obviously I'm a sensible centrist, Catherine, but I follow a number of right-wing accounts too, and there's some weird stuff that goes on that does the rounds. Do you remember a while back there was that woman who talked about spice? She became known as the spice
Oh,
mammy,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, is this an example of something that is fairly innocuous becoming like low-key porn? Because she did that. I mean, the famous one was she put her hands on her hips, and this did the round, and then people were like going wild for her.
I
As if
mean,
she was just
maybe,
like,
yeah. That's something it could be perceived as pornographic. I think maybe closer to something that is basically porn is like there's a lot of quote unquote like trad influencers, and they're not really giving advice on how to live a traditional lifestyle. They're sort of showing off their own traditional lifestyle, but it does feel sort of fetishistic. It doesn't really feel like they're not. It's not instructive, certainly. Generously, it's just aesthetic, and they're just sort of showing off something pretty, including themselves. But it's also like, who is it really for? Is it for other women who want to be like that and want to change their lifestyle, or maybe want validation of a lifestyle they're already living? Or is it for men who find this arousing in some way?
yeah. The thing was, there was always a bit of that on normal television, right? I'm thinking of like, I don't know. I mean, on the cookery front, there was Nigella Lawson, obviously, but who was I'm trying to remember her name now. you probably didn't get in America, but on RTV there was, I think it was Roald Dahl's daughter or granddaughter, Sophie Dahl. Was it her? There was like a kind of so what am I thinking of? There was a woman whose basic thing was being a domestic goddess, right? And you know, her show was just about her, like, you know, making the house look nice and things like that. But there was an element to it that was selling a kind of. There was obviously a sexual element to it as well, you know, to sell to men. And in a weird way, the trad wife space is just kind of taking that same idea and just making it, you know, it's repackaging it for a different context. Would you not say?
Absolutely. And you know, to some extent, like sex sells, and it's not, and it's aspirational for women too. And it can be difficult to where to draw the line. Where is just sort of a natural extension of marketing, where like something that is more visually pleasing is obviously going to do better with an audience. And then when is it pornographic? I think like the show you're describing, I haven't seen, I'm not familiar with it, but there's still something instructive about it, right? And it's just more palatable because it's a beautiful woman who is doing the instruction. There's something, it remains aspirational because she's teaching you something. But with a lot of these other accounts, they might do a little bit of that, but like, you know, a TikTok where you have your tits out and there's a mixer, right? And like, you're allegedly making cookies. That's not like teaching someone how to make cookies. That's sort of like putting the idea in their head, and really what you're actually showing off is like your willingness to do the thing, and then your body or your beauty.
I think the person I was thinking of, by the way, is called Anthea Turner, and she has a book called, or she had her TV series was called The Perfect Housewife. And I'll just show you the front cover to show you what I mean, what I was talking about. You can only get it on eBay now, but I don't know if you can see my screen.
I can't.
Can you see it now?
No, I can.
I mean, can you see that? You know,
yeah, that's. I mean,
there's definitely an element to that, which is, you know, she's not just telling you how to clean the floor or do ironing. There's another element to it.
That's. I mean, you're right to point out this is a criticism sort of as old as time, right? Like any criticism of advertising, dating back to like the 60s at least, is going to be, you know, we're using women's bodies to attract. There's you know, numerous movies, the beauty myth, of course. There's all sorts of. This is a well-worn criticism. I think where the internet changes it a little bit is it's more than just advertising. It's more than just sort of a corporate-backed thing. It's also individual people, and it's getting increasingly stranger.
Yeah. The other person who had the Nigella Lawson also had a book. I didn't know this until I was trying to find out Anthea Turner's name. She had a book called How to Be a Domestic Goddess as well. In the 2000s, of course, everything was a bit more tongue-in-cheek. The trad wives on Twitter, who I noticed that you like to criticize them, Catherine. Is that because you think that they are insincere in some way, or do you think they're grifting, or do you think they are selling something false? Like, why do you like to pick on them in particular?
I don't think I pick on them any more than I pick on anyone else. I don't have a problem with like the lifestyle per se. I have a problem with one. There is a grifting element, and it's at odds with the professed values. I have a real sort of like Gen X style aversion to anything I see as inauthentic or insincere. I don't know where it comes from, but I think probably one of my my worst traits is constantly calling people posers when I'm in no position to do such a thing. So I think there's an element of that. And also I tend to criticize them when they're criticizing other women. And it's like such a, like, because they're not even productively or rather constructively like criticizing women. What they're doing is they're taking criticism as a product to ingratiate themselves to men who don't even really respect them. And it's just like annoying to watch.
And is this the pick-meism that you talk about? That behavior that you just described, is that being a pick-me because she's basically using talking points that she's seen men say and reflecting them back to get likes from those men, something like that?
Right. Like, and I'm criticizing an abstract group, not any individual, but I'm criticizing women right now, right? So like, I guess someone would say like, oh, that's, are you being a pick-me? Maybe, I don't know. I don't think so. But it feels like, where is the criticism coming from? Why is it being shared? What's the purpose of it? Like, what values do I profess? I think those are all components of it.
Yeah, I mean, I used to find this a little bit with libertarians in general, but especially libertarian women. The punchline to a lot of their stuff is basically like, why can't you be good like me? Why can't you be like, I'm like the perfect example of what to be? So there's a lot of it is kind of weirdly self-referential, or like, it's not even it's just open bragging that they're epitomizing something that you should be. And it's usually, I mean, in that space, it's usually something like, submit to your husband or something like that, right? I've got 3 kids and managed to do all the chores, and I still have the dinner on the table by the right time or whatever. Which is
it's also like especially weird because it's like, well, why are they saying these things? Like, it's one thing if like a woman in your religious community or in like your sort of local environment is sharing these things. It's another when it's like because you really do have to, like, what do they gain from sharing this? Is it really so other women can live that same lifestyle? And I highly doubt a lot of them believe that it's actually going to lead to like more social stability or something. And you can tell when there definitely are women who do believe that. And there's a huge difference in the way they speak, the register, what their content is. Everyone's selling something, but what group A is selling as opposed to what group B is selling. And I think it annoys everyone. Honestly, I don't think it's unique to me. I think it annoys a lot of men as well.
Well, it's basically just right-wing virtue signaling, essentially. I mean, it's the same as the left winger, like chastising people for being racist or whatever else, or showing how not sexist they are, or not racist they are, or whatever else. Yes, it's a very strange little thing. I've been keeping an eye on that sphere for a while because I've had my own run-in with another group, the Trad Dads. I don't know if you've come across them.
No, I haven't.
I think this is one of those. This happened when I think you were offline for a while, because you sporadically kind of go offline for a couple of 3 weeks or a month or something, and then you come back, right? You do that every once in a while. I think this episode happened when you weren't around, but I basically just said, listen, being a dad is not the most masculine thing you can do, right?
Oh, I remember this.
Yeah, do you remember that? And
yeah.
Suddenly this this got picked up on, and I started getting massively dunked on by hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of these and it would typically be like a guy with a cigar, in an American, like he'd be posing outside an American football stadium, and he'd be like, proud Catholic dad, that was his whole thing. And that was one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen, because there were guys just saying like, yeah, the most manly thing you can do is to like simmer a stew for your children. And I'm like, in no world is that the most masculine thing that you can do, I say this as a dad myself. I have a 3-year-old daughter. I spend a lot of time with her. When I'm brushing her hair and helping her pick out a pink dress or whatever, I don't pretend that this is the most masculine I can possibly be, right? I mean, probably leading an army somewhere and conquering a territory would be more masculine than that, or something, or I don't know, like doing the laundry or something like that. these are just kind of normal chores that you just have to do, being an adult in the world. And so my whole thing was like, you're setting the bar like super duper low here. What counts as like being masculine? Like, it's not that difficult to father a child, and it's also not that difficult to like do basic chores around the house. You've got to like, masculinity really has to be about achieving something at the end of the day, in my view. And I was just completely unaware that this was a sphere that exists too, the trad dads, which actually seems a lot more casual than the trad wives, but there we are.
Right, because they have like who are they selling to, and who's buying. I mean, I agree with a lot of these sort of like Jordan Peterson tier criticisms that there's like a crisis of masculinity and like a twin crisis of femininity. And being a dad feels very masculine in a world where, one, you might not be integrated into any kind of larger community, or you may not have grown up with a father, or maybe you did grow up in a traditional household, but you just aren't seeing it. So it becomes very distant from your experience, and you start to romanticize it. And what's interesting is like, this is true of, I think, all kind of roles. There's this romanticization of military leadership, even if not the military leadership reflected in your home country's actual military. I mean, there's all sorts of bodybuilding is sort of another one, and I think that there's not enough like brotherhood in people's physical immediate lives, and it creates these weird idealizations of things that should, like, exercising is another thing that should just be like very ordinary, but it isn't.
So what you're saying is, like, to the kid in the 1950s, all of this stuff would have been second nature, but now these things feel like some sort of achievement that have to be signaled in a performative, something like that.
Yeah, the kid in the 1950s might have like a different vision of heroism because he's more integrated into a community, and there's more examples, and he knows what's expected of most people and what's exemplary. But right now there's sort of just nothing, and you kind of have to build it yourself. And so for some people, for whatever reason, it'll be being a father.
Do you think all of that is a consequence of just being online, or do you think there are wider?
I think there's definitely wider social trends. I think being online exacerbates it. My take is, it's not so much that the internet like ruined everything as much as there was all of these trends that were already happening, and it just made it so much worse. It's an amplification tool.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that I'm a little concerned with is the way in which porn itself, the impact of porn, actual porn now, has on the kind of sexual imagination of a lot of, I mean, not just kids. It could be anybody who's been on the internet for a long time, right? Surely it kind of warps how you think, how you engage with and think about these things, and kind of denaturalizes and makes strange the actual real world, doing of real world sex, to put it that way. Have you looked at that at all? Because I've looked at a lot of data recently that basically says that young people just aren't having sex. Like, we're having a lot less sex than certainly my generation would have done when we were teenagers.
This isn't data backed at all, but I have this intuition that porn brain is not as difficult to fix as people think. I don't think like high volumes of porn are good. We probably agree there. But I also don't think all hope is lost. I think like, again, it amplifies a problem rather than causing it. You don't have enough physical interaction with other people, and there's all sorts of things like Me Too definitely didn't help. The confusion about like what sex is, what gender is. There's all sorts of disorienting factors here, and then it's like, well, you may as well look at porn. It's free, it's private, no one has to know anything about it. You get your release valve. but then it, it desensitizes you, but you were already at a disadvantaged point when you started.
Yeah, it's kind of weird though, because in read a lot of kind of conservative critiques of various things. Like, in fact, I've been reading a lot about this in various books recently. Like, I've been reading a book called Sex and Deviance by Guillaume Fay, and I was just looking over F. Roger Devlin's Sexual Utopia book. And one of the things that's easy to forget about is that in the 90s, people were like, the conservatives were really in a kind of panic about how much sex was going on, how much teenage, like how degenerate people were, and so on. Now that has been maintained as a critique. People are always going on about degeneracy, but it strikes me that what has actually happened is almost the opposite. It's almost like a kind of a great moderation, if you want, of sexual behaviors, because people just don't do anything. Like those Zoomers I saw in the club who were just on their phones. I mean, they're not going to be engaging in orgies or having having like triple body counts. They're probably all virgins. So in a strange way, the modernity gave the conservatives what they wanted. Am I wrong?
Sort of. I think like once sex really entered the marketplace, and very unregulated marketplace, that's when problems started to arise. Sex, the meaning of sex is ever shifting. I sort of think like the sex recession actually started much earlier than people think. Pickup artists emerge immediately after the sexual revolution, and then they like really boom in the early 2000s. And for them to be booming, they need customers. And why would they have customers? But because men feel like they're not successful in the market. So I suspect like it's, part of it is just like, a regulation problem. There aren't enough guardrails. And that's why people aren't having sex. And because they're not having sex, they're going to other avenues, and they're trying to fill that space in their lives. Somehow.
Yeah, I actually, if you just bear with me a second, hold on. I actually just read about this happening because I was looking over it's called Sexual Utopia in Power by F. Roger Devlin. But he has a chapter in there which is basically just a review of a book that was written in 2007 by hold on, page 73, by Wendy Shalit. It was called Girls Gone Mad: Young Women Reclaim Self-Respect and Find It's Not Bad to Be Good. Random House, 2007.
Yeah, I know this book.
Yeah, have you come across this? And I mean, the basic argument, as far as I can tell, is that, and I remember this acutely from the 1990s, there was a huge cultural push to become a bad girl, right? Sometimes quite literally, it was just like as explicit as just saying like bad girl. But I mean, in this country, it was also the ladette culture, right? Where just like men, she too can go out for pints and go on the pole and slap boys' asses and things like that. And it was basically, I mean, this was a big push in the 70s and the 80s for women basically to become as, I don't want to say promiscuous, but basically to become sexually liberated in that way, so that they also play the field and go out clubbing and, have body counts and things like that. And this book was a sequel to an earlier one that she wrote called A Return to Modesty, right? Where she is actually arguing that this trend that we're talking about, i.e. the decrease in sexual encounters, the fact that kids aren't having sex, is actually some sort of rebellion against the feminist push for the bad girl or the ladette, or all these trends that were going in the opposite direction. Any thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree that's an element of it. I was actually, before we hopped on, I was listening to a podcast, and they were discussing how there's like this minor Twitter drama between millennials in the BDSM community and Zoomers. And Zoomers were like basically critiquing millennials for promoting promoting a sexuality that they didn't feel benefited them. But part of that was also like, ew, you guys are old. It's just not cool anymore. But yeah, I mean, I agree that like the sort of like raunch feminism of the 90s and 2000s caused more problems than it solved. I mean, mostly because it's telling women to, and this is sort of an old hat criticism of it at this point, but that true liberation is acting like a man instead of leaning into what it means to be a woman. And sort of this like framing liberation as like male behavior as the default, and acting like that, like that's some kind that's going to benefit people, and it doesn't really benefit anyone. It doesn't benefit men, and it doesn't serve women.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in my experience, I don't know any women who quote unquote slept around that felt good about it or that made them feel good. It tends to do the opposite, right? It tends to make them feel bad about themselves, or I mean, you could argue that the reasons for that are kind of residues of old social stigma and whatnot, but I just think it's because women and men relate to sex in a different way. I feel like women find it much more difficult to detach the emotional component from the
Absolutely. I mean, you see a rise in all these articles like how not to catch feelings. But I think even more salient is like men also don't like having like high volumes of meaningless sex. Gay men might, but even gay men really don't, because it's like a quarter of gay men behave that way. And somehow it gets portrayed as like all men are super right. It's all gay men and really all straight men, but it's not really a behavioral pattern that any person benefits from. It's a minority of people, really.
Just the most visible subset, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I know a lot of guys who literally just marry the first girl who smiled at them, and that's it. I do think that it's underrated how many guys just want to settle down like immediately, or have a long-term partner. Because I think there's often a tendency to assume that all men just want to be like chads who have scores of women on their notches in their bedpost, but it's not actually true of the majority of men that you see. But lots of them are.
To go back to your previous point, like how much of that is just like vanishing examples of like what it means to be masculine, and so you kind of take what you have available, or you over romanticize what you've seen in media.
Just to try to go back to online stuff a second. I mean, we could stick with what we've been talking about, but it always strikes me that the internet, especially social media and Twitter, but also even some of the smaller ones, this especially happens on places like Telegram. I came off Telegram. I think it's a terrible platform. But there are smaller or more niche sites like that. I think they tend to the internet has a way of tending towards extremes rather than tending towards moderation, right? So, but what I mean by that is, I kind of feel that you can just have a much more kind of practical and realistic look at what we've been talking about without veering wildly towards like, oh well, the solution is just to be like the uber trad wife, or the solution is to, and what I see in so much discourse, it is almost the opposite, that it kind of peels towards like the absolute extreme view, like no, it must be 100% Catholic monarchism, or on the other hand no, you must push the PUA treat every hole of gold type thing. What do you think about the internet and extremity?
I mean, nuance doesn't really happen online. You did see it a lot in forums where it was like smaller groups. think part of that is there's so much chaos and noise that extreme positions impose a structure that people don't even realize they're craving. And I think they're craving it not just because of the architecture of online social spaces, but also because there's just no structure anywhere. So you look for it where you can find it, and it's very easy to find its embrace on the internet.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that? That it imposes a certain structure, like in terms of like ideological rigidness, or how do you?
Yeah, I think people want rigidity. Online, it's partially just because there's so much going on, and I think it's a way to kind of like protect yourself from the chaos of the internet. It's like, these are who my people are. This is what we believe. There's no gray area. It is what it is. And that's why it happens online. But I think also in general, words increasingly are losing meaning. We don't really know what anything is for. And so, of course, like, these sort of extreme positions are going to be appealing to people. People are searching for structure in all sorts of ways. There was, I don't know if you remember this or if this was just an American thing, but there was like a moment there where like people couldn't stop talking about multi-level marketing schemes. I mean, part of the multi-level marketing scheme is it imposes structure on your life in every which way, and it changes your vocabulary. It changes. It gives you something to do. It gives you clear goals. There's rituals. There's all sorts of things that are just totally lost. And then like suddenly we all like kind of woke up to the fact of like, why is everyone around us, hawking some product and trying to get me involved in a pyramid scheme? It's not just an economic thing. I think it's also, there's like something socially that's gone awry. But I think it's downstream of the same problem.
Interesting. How much do you attribute to because this is something else I see, and you'll see on any given day. There's also something called, I guess you call it the take economy.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Where somebody has a take on something, and then because they've had that take in front of literally thousands of people, sometimes tens of thousands of people, it's quite hard to back down from it, right? So they have to kind of then double and triple and quadruple down. So then you get these factions arising out of the actual take itself, right? Which kind of happens all the time on Twitter. Do you have any insights into the impact of the take economy on how people? Does that also drive extremes in a way?
Absolutely. I think it makes it hard to be principled. So what you end up doing is you lean towards these like extremism through like tribes, right? So this is what my people believe, and that can shift. I mean, I tweeted something last night that something to the effect of like, it's not really the take that's ever the problem; it's who posted it. Of course, that doesn't mean that like any person can post anything, or like there's like you can't be ousted from a group if you express the wrong opinion. But there's definitely like a tribal element. The take economy is interesting because there's all sorts of things that are feeding into it. One, there's like everyone is in like a cabal of like half a dozen group chats where like people are coordinating takes. It's kind of warring for attention. I wonder how often it's actually about the issue. I think it usually has other influences.
Yeah, like, do you like that person or not? Things like
right.
that. Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting thing. There's another thing I've noticed as well, which is that often, especially younger folk, but just in general online, people cannot process disagreement without thinking that you've fallen out with someone. Right? I mean, let's say I don't know, someone I'm friendly with. If we ever have a disagreement, they always say, "Oh, I hate it when mummy and daddy fight." They always say things like that. And I then get DMs saying, "Oh, please don't kick this guy off the show or whatever." But like, from when people just have disagreements all the time, you can be friends with someone and disagree with them. this idea that you all have to be on the same page to remain friends is kind of strange to me. Is that something that has an impact too, that kind of creates these tribes that you're talking about? Because
Yeah,
it's almost like
people walk on
disagreement's not
eggshells.
allowed.
And this, I don't know if this is like how old this problem is. I do remember people started talking about it a lot more. Again, like in the early 2010s, there's that book, Conflict is Not Abuse. Because this professor had realized that like people are struggling to disagree. And I don't know what causes that. But there is this aversion to friction basically everywhere.
Yeah, no, I guess it's there's a whole like vocabulary around this as well. Like in our spaces, it's called like a counter signal, right? You want to be seen to counter signal a friend, but it could just be a disagreement, not a counter signal, right? But those sorts of things can lead to friction down the line, as or people perceive it as drama. Then when all that's happened is that you disagree with a take or whatever. I made a video a while back called Against Ideology, because I happen to think that and in fact that book I was reading earlier on, Devlin he was talking about feminism, but let me see if I can find the actual passage here. He was saying first a caveat, okay? This is just quoting from Devlin. It's in a chapter called Home Economics. He says, first a caveat. Most critical discussions of feminism concentrate on refuting its doctrines, such as the ascription of feminine traits to upbringing rather than to nature. My approach will be different. While such formal refutation of doctrines is not valueless, it seems to me to mistake the fundamental character of feminism. The feminist movement consists essentially not of ideas at all, but of attitudes or even mere emotions. Feminist theory, as it is grandiloquently called, is simply whatever the woman in the movement has come up with in post facto justification of their attitudes and emotions. A heavy focus on feminist doctrine seems to me symptomatic of the rationalist fallacy, the assumption that people are motivated primarily by beliefs. If they were, the best way to combat an armed doctrine would indeed be to demonstrate that its beliefs are false. But in the case of feminism, even more than Marxism and other political ideologies, it is rather the beliefs that are motivated by various personal and non-rational needs. I propose, therefore, that feminism may better be understood through a consideration of the feminist herself. And I mean, I take the view from Vilfredo Pareto that it's not just feminism; it's literally all political ideologies are what he describes there, downstream from kind of feelings that people have that you post hoc rationalize. This was the argument of Jonathan Haidt as well. And I'm very disinclined to say, oh, here is a list of all the things I stand for. Because it's just like so much of it is just post hoc rationalization for what I feel at some level. What do you think about that?
I agree for the most part. I think the other thing is like with feminism in particular, it's just I feel like there's like a lack of integration almost, and a lot of the critiques that happen with anything, there's like some sort of myopia that starts happening. So it's like a lot of things that feminists say are like technically true. Well, first of all, I mean, there's many different kinds of feminists, right? But like I'm trying to think of an example like off the top of my head. Like yes, it's probably like not good for women if they can't have like a bank account and can't have financial independence, especially if they're like in an abusive marriage, for example, right? But then this becomes like divorced from like a broader social critique, and it's almost too focused. It's like what, like, is it specifically about women that like it's difficult to leave abusive marriages? Were there other changes that made it like more difficult for abusive husbands to be held accountable? There's all these different layers to it that I think the at least most popular arguments end up missing, just probably because of the way these things are transmitted. And I'm not saying like every feminist is guilty of this, but I think that's something that happens. It's like somehow divorced from its context. So when you really start poking at it, it feels like it doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just before we hit the super chats, Catherine, where do you think things are going to go from here? Because I have I've seen kind of various articles and things saying that younger people now, lots of them, don't actually go on the same social media sites as everybody else. That famously a lot of them are on TikTok, right? But they're not actually on like Twitter and Facebook and things in the same sort of numbers as earlier generations. Is that true that we're seeing like is it possible that social media has peaked and that in 20, 30 years time people will look back and wonder how we were all on social media all the time, or do you see it going on indefinitely?
It might have revivals, but I tend to agree with that we're about to enter like an internet dark age where most of the activity is happening in more private situations like Discord servers or platforms like Discord, maybe using social media, but like paying particular attention to like group DMs. And I don't even think we're going to see that. I think that like we are actually already there. I've always had this feeling like God help you if you're not in like a sufficient number of group chats, right? Or if you're not, invited to the right Telegram groups or Discord servers or whatever.
Just before we hit the super chat, somebody in the chat is saying we didn't talk about memes enough. We didn't talk about old memes enough. What are some of your favorite? I don't want to put you on the spot, but what are some of your favorite old memes? We might as well just ask about that before we get over here.
I don't think I have any favorite old memes. I've never been someone who uses them much. I definitely like will laugh at them if I'm sent them, but no templates that are immediately recognizable.
There's only one meme that I consistently laugh at, and it's a fairly new one, which is basically whenever anyone posts crime stats or whatever, and somebody just puts a picture of Scott Adams underneath. That makes me laugh every single time. But other than that, I've never been much of a. I've actually never been that much of a meme guy. I never. I don't know if any noticed. I never post like an Apu or a Pepe or anything like that because I don't know. Maybe I'm too much of a contrarian or individualist or whatever. So I don't want to feel like a part of a community.
I'm a big acronym person, but I'm not a big meme person.
Okay, well, what are some of your big acronyms then? What are some good acronyms? I actually earlier on made a post with IRL there, and somebody asked what it was. What does IRL stand for? I don't know if they were being ironic or whatever, but what are some good acronyms?
The ones I use most frequently, for some reason I've started using SWIM, swim, someone who isn't me, a lot. AFK, it's another one that I use a lot. RTFA. They're dated, but I feel like they're very useful.
BRB.
Yeah.
That was one. I always find it funny. We have a Zoomer girl who comes on our stream sometimes called Cows. She says lol in real life. She just goes lol, which I've never heard somebody do before she started doing it. But other people have started doing it now as well. So that's no. I mean, some of those things you never. How would you say LMAO? Lamau.
Yeah, I've heard people say Lamau. I hate that.
You hate Lamau, right?
Yeah, I mean, I hate when people say like LOL or LMAO, IRL, but like I'll say IRL.
IRL, yeah. What's the other one? Ruffle. Ruffle.
Oh, I haven't seen that in a while. That
Yeah,
one
people
didn't
don't
have a
seem
lot
to
of
use
shelf
that
life.
as much these days.
CTFU I use a lot though.
CTAU. What's that?
CTFU, cracking the F up.
Having it. Okay. CTF. What about IIRC? If I recall
If I recall
correctly.
correctly,
Yeah.
I use that one a lot. Yeah, these are some good early internet acronyms.
Yeah, those lingo. Yeah. Well, see if anybody has any others they can remember. Let's have a look. Ruffle, Lamau, Me Too. WTF, yeah. WTF. Yeah, but no, we're talking about abbreviations because neither of us like memes very much. So that's why. Okay, do you have a couple of minutes to do some super chats before we leave?
Sure.
On entropy, Coney, current year says, I was just old enough to see the last days of the pre-smartphone web 2.0, but too young to truly experience and interact with it. Something that I am jealous of many millennials for having experienced. So there we go. Coney also says, I think that Discord is probably the closest emulation of the old pre-smartphone web 2.0 forums. It just does not have the same open access like social media websites like Twitter and Facebook have. Yeah. Escalating entropy says, now that he's dead, will you be doing a deepest lore about the Jerry Springer show? Better yet, you could just do one of the funniest TV segments ever aired. You are not the father from the Maori show. Any thoughts about Jerry Springer, Catherine?
I was gonna jump in there and say I love that kind of television. I miss it desperately. I was a truant. I actually ended up dropping out of school, and most of my time was spent on AOL and watching Jerry Springer and Maury and all all these shows. I love them. Dr. Phil, the great.
I've told this story before, but one of the darkest things I've ever seen on television, and I've spent years looking for it, the episode, and I can't find it. I mean, try finding an individual episode of Jerry Springer, right? One of the funniest things, it's not funny, it's haunting. I still think about it now. Is that the whole setup of the show was my wife is too fat, right? So this guy, this guy wanted to leave his wife because she was too fat, and they had her literally in her bra and knickers, riding an exercise bike live in the studio, and she had to ride it for the entire show to show that she loved this guy and was willing to put the work in to lose the weight to stay with him. And she was absolutely sweating, and the camera was like panning in the back and like showing the sweat going down her back and so on. Well, anyway, that was disturbing enough. But then the second couple were a lesbian couple, where it was like one skinny woman and one fat woman, and they got this, like a child's paddling pool.
Oh no!
They got a child's paddling pool. They filled it with mud, and they had the fat one again in her underwear, sitting there eating a corn on the cob, and the other one's going oink, oink like a pig. Go on, oink like a pig. I'm a fat pig. I was like, what is this is so weird. And Jerry Springer just like sitting there, watching it all with his hand. When he did that kind of pensive look with his hand on his chin. I don't know what he was thinking about, but I don't even know what that show was about or why it was ever aired, but it was dark, so dark.
I mean, all of these shows were so dark. I mean, a lot of it, was scripted, but it was a very like dark. This is how the other half lives, kind of, sideshow attraction. I mean, really, I think they did fill the role of freak shows.
We had one in this country called the Jeremy Kyle Show, and he was a bit more polemic than Springer, right? So it'd typically be like a couple from a council estate, which I guess is the UK equivalent of a what do you have in a housing project in America? Is that what they call them?
Yeah,
but But I think that has more of like a black connotation, whereas here, you get white people living in council estates. So it'd be typically like a kind of chavvy couple, and the guy, he'd be on the dole, he'd be getting benefits, and he doesn't go to work, and it'd be like, and basically they'd come on, they'd introduce themselves, they then start fighting and arguing and all the rest of it. And Jeremy Kyle would cut in, and his spiel would always be the same. He'd be like, "Do you know what I think, Derek? I think you need to sort your life out, mate." Massive round of applause. Get off the drugs. Get off your ass. Get a job. And that's literally the whole show was Jeremy Kyle just berating these people for being failures in life, and getting a massive round of applause for it. Which did make this was in Jerry Springer as well. There was kind of like a moral element where.
Yeah, like at least we're not them.
Yeah, and the crowd would like, oh, I've been cheating on my husband for the past 2 years. I don't care. Boo! Everybody would be like, and do you remember that bit where they'd get the audience members? They'd be able to get up and get on the mic and, tell the couple what they thought of them and stuff. There was a lot of like moral condemnation in Jerry Springer, which I think people remember the trash TV part, but there's this weird moral judgment part.
Oh yeah,
well.
Absolutely. There's a huge moral component. I mean, that's kind of why they went out of fashion too. I think it doesn't really square with, contemporary society.
Yeah, the judginess part. Yes, I remember there was a West End show called Jerry Springer the Opera that I went to see. It was actually really funny. So yeah, that happened as well. Adam E said,
interesting. Oh, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. If you ever want to see Jerry Springer, I think it was written by Stuart Lee, the smug left-wing comedian. I was a fan of his when I was now he's just almost intolerable.
Well, I wanted to jump in and say that like wokeness kind of killed Jerry Springer and similar shows because like the people who would have been on Jerry Springer are now like considered evil, and so the moral condemnation has sort of changed valence, which actually kind of like what's worse, being the butt of the joke, or I don't know. They're both bad. Yeah.
Do you think there's an association between now conservatives or MAGA and the typical kind of trailer trash you'd see on Jerry Springer?
Yeah, I think ultimately it's like more of a class thing, right? It's there's a conflation of like it I don't know quite how to put this, but we have like a long history of not being very Americans, at least, not being very kind to like working class and lower class white people, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's all coming back to me now. Speak to the hand because the face ain't listening and all that sort of stuff. You got it, girl. Go, girl. There was a lot of that stuff on Jerry Springer as well. Basically, people like refuse, like people doing really bad things and then trying to just justify it through attitude, essentially.
Because really, what Jerry Springer is saying is not that like any given behavior is bad. It's that like, white people in trailer parks are jokes, are morally repugnant jokes.
And Jerry Springer allowed people to feel smug and superior about themselves.
Yeah. Now that my mom hated it, now that I'm like making all these connections out loud, it actually, as much as I enjoy watching that kind of TV, it's actually awful now that I'm like saying just explicitly what it is and what purpose it served.
It was horrible.
Maybe it's good they're gone. Yeah, it's the worst. It is haunting. You're exactly correct.
Yeah, but you see, there was a weird double corrosion though, because on the one hand, it was allowing well-to-do sorts to just kind of look their noses down at scum, but on the other hand, there was this weird libertine individualism where the people who were pushing back against the moral condemnation of the crowd were actually, in a strange way, pushing an ideology of the refusal of judgment, which actually then turns into the much more permissive culture that you see 10, 15 years later that ultimately ends up killing something like Jerry Springer, right? Because the judgment part was then unpalatable, because what they're seeing is, oh, how can you pick on this fat black woman or whatever?
Right. Well, they changed the locus of how they're going to judge the same demographic. Like you can no longer say, well, like, oh, this trailer park trash, quote unquote, is like in a polyamorous marriage. Like the polyamorous marriage part, that's fine, right? But now we need a new vector to.
Do you think there'll ever be like a kind of reverse Jerry Springer where you've got like a blue-haired feminist lesbian and they just bring on like a normal couple, and it's like, oh, we've been married for 20 years and we've never cheated, and the crowd goes boo, there's just kind of like a complete reverse Jerry Springer where just like heteronormative.
That's a lot of the internet, right? That's a lot of digital media right now.
That is the internet, yeah.
The Slate and Vice column is kind of that,
If I was more enterprising, maybe I could be the first reverse Jerry Springer. It'd be like, making fun of like committed Christians or whatever, just for having normal lives. Adam E says, perhaps this is wrong perhaps this is the wrong forum for this question, but how could the internet be put back into its bottle? I like the idea of the AOL bundle that locks you into an approved experience, as well as the computer room to limit usage. Yeah, we've kind of started talking about this already, Catherine. Maybe social media peaked, but can the internet per se be put back in its bottle?
I think it can't happen through social change. It would need to happen through
Top
regulation.
Down.
Yeah.
I mean, I've made lots of videos in my time, and there was one video I made because everybody was saying like, oh, you guys are always talking about the problems. You never provide any solutions, right? What is the sort of society that you'd like to see? And I made a video where I gave a positive vision, right, of the sort of society that I want to see, and I tried to come up with some policies and how I would protect it and so on. It was based on an old kid show called Trumpton, which is a lovely little show set in an English village where, there's a mayor and, a miller and a farmer and just a little quaint little English village. And I was basically going through like, well, how would I maintain this in the modern world? And the first thing I wanted to do was to confiscate people's smartphones. And I got so much pushback for that, Catherine. It's unreal. They were like, you want to try to recreate North Korea? You're basically worse than Stalin and all the rest of it. So maybe people aren't there quite yet. People aren't ready to lose their smartphone.
People get so sensitive when you even mildly suggest any boundaries. I get called a reactionary a lot, as you could probably tell. I'm not one. But the thing that started this is I said, I didn't even say definitively. I said, maybe there's an upper limit to how many sexual partners any individual person can have before it starts having a negative effect on them. That's it. Mm-hmm. And then that was the beginning of the end. It was crazy. They hate boundaries.
Yeah, that basically makes you a fascist, Catherine, for suggesting such a thing. Very, very interesting. So, I mean, there would have to be a pretty big shift in either style of government or attitudes towards the internet for something like that to happen. Because I feel like people just aren't ready to lose their phones quite at this minute.
I think part of the thing that underlies it is if we had a firewall of like the Great Firewall of China, we had regulations like that. There's a real mistrust of the government, and people would be like, well, we won't really know what's going on. Where will we get information? This isn't information. Any kind of boundary will be seen as oh no, this. It's more than just you can't use something as you wish. But I think there's a fear that things will start happening and nobody will know what's going on.
Now, I was talking about this earlier on, though, right? Because I think there's a tendency to think, well, the internet has given us a lot more truth, and it's kind of opened up spaces like this, right? We wouldn't have had this conversation pre-internet. I wouldn't have had my channel. We wouldn't have had our Twitter things, and a lot of the information that we share wouldn't have been out there. But as somebody who grew up with like 3 or 4 channels on TV, I kind of miss the old homogenous culture where everybody just watched the same stuff and had the same. Everybody knew the same things and had the same cultural cachet, and the internet's destroyed all that because everything's heterogeneous and everything is these kind of. I mean, we didn't talk about subcultures, Catherine, but this is a huge part of the internet, right? Is everybody's off in their own little spaces, and you have, you have people who know everything there is to know about a band that only 20,000 people have ever heard of, but they couldn't name the Beatles. Or something like that, and I just find it like it's one of the things that I would kind of take, not knowing all the stuff I know about like how things work and so on, just to go back to the pre-internet world. In a way, I feel like everybody was happier in that.
I don't know if everyone. Well, maybe people were happier. Media was definitely better, in my opinion. I went to I don't remember if the museum was about puppets. Not to keep bringing up, I used to be a puppeteer, just to add some context to that example. But maybe like a Jim Henson museum or something. And I remember thinking like, this could only exist in like a world where there's public media and not everyone has a platform, and it's kind of like a smaller world. And I just was like, I got so sad. I was like, man, I wish it was just harder for to be seen. So the people who are seen are like more interesting or something. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's how I felt.
No, it absolutely does. I mean, see, the thing is that I don't know if everybody else is, maybe in everybody else's group chats they're coordinating or whatnot. In the group chat I'm part of, I can't be part of many because I'm notoriously bad on DMs and things like that. But in the one I'm part of, it's just mainly us moaning about reply guys, like the absolute epidemic of reply guyism. And I just think, like on a daily basis, I just think none of these people need to have a voice at all. Maybe even I don't need to have a voice. Maybe it was just better when everything was completely top down, with few people deciding who can go on TV. It doesn't really matter like if their intentions are clandestine. I feel like the mess, like breaking all that apart, has created a bigger mess than we had before. That's what I feel like. But
I think so too. I'm with you on that.
So I remember bringing that up to somebody in 2002 when I was in university, a postmodern professor, and he called me a Stalinist. So maybe I'm a Stalinist, but I don't know. There's a lot, because you see, even that kind of TV monoculture was an ersatz surrogate culture, a national, in the case of Britain, a kind of shared surrogate culture in the absence of a real culture. I would say it was almost like the simulacra of a culture, but at least any random person that you met would have seen all the same TV shows and have all the same kind of cultural touchstones and references that you would have had. And I just find it amazing that in the space of one generation, it's all been lost, to the point where I can seriously make posts parodying Zoomers for not knowing who Marlon Brando is. And like, genuinely, lots of people don't know who Marlon Brando is. I mean, I just don't. It's unfathomable to me that this could happen so quickly. But there it is. It's happened. So maybe I'm just an old man yelling at a cloud. Who knows?
Probably both.
Probably both. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Adam E says, "Is Web3/Fedverse? I think those are the same things. The next big thing." Yeah. What is Web3/Fedverse?
Oh, the Fediverse. Like, he's talking about blockchain, right? Like federated, like little islands that are connected by blockchain. I don't actually. It seems like the Web3 thing has ramped down a little bit. Maybe Web3, as it's been described to us, isn't the future. I actually don't know. I don't have a good answer.
There's a guy in the chat saying AA's problem with the replygasm is purely only when he's faced with success and disagreement. He only interacts when he perceives easy victory. You've got to remember, Jeff, I think pro wrestling is life. And if you're the guy with the platform, you are the booker. So you therefore choose your opponents, right? I mean, it's just basic stuff. You can highlight who the thousands of people get to see and who they don't. So it's all part of the but everybody does that, right? Everybody chooses who they respond to. You're never going to respond to someone who's going to make you look bad. Why would you ever do that?
I do it all the time. I respond to everyone.
Yeah, you need to be more select. You need to
100%
understand your
response
power,
rate.
Catherine. Is the one you're the one with the 30,000 plus follower account, right? So you can choose the terrain that you work on and carefully stage manage. I mean, you can puppeteer if you want. Use your puppet background to. You can puppeteer the kind of kayfabe narrative that your followers get to see. Or is that too manipulative? I don't know. Okay. Chris Primer says, R.I.P. low tax. Something awful used to be cool. Did you ever go on something awful?
I didn't. It's funny though. I've been mentioned there in recent history a couple of times, which sort of blew me away. I wasn't aware it was like still pretty active.
Yeah, I never went on something awful. I was like purely a kind of just I was on the music forum or on the film forum, or when I was into horror films, I go on the horror film forum because it was a very fast way to get to know something super in depth, to be amongst the hardcore fans of that thing. I mean, this is something else we kind of touched on, Catherine, which is the normalization of all of those spaces, which then destroys them. I think there's a name for that process that happens where normies infiltrate a space and then what it was transforms and falls apart.
It's sort of eternal September, but that's describing when like students would log on and you have a bunch of new users. But I think there should be an updated name for it.
Yeah. EC90 says AA is not a beggar. He is a humble mug merchant. Captain Smith says, on the train the other day, overheard Zoomer girl say, I hate driving a manual car. I have to put my phone down to gear change. She shouldn't be on her phone in the car anyway, of course. MNDB says, this stream is amazing. You're amazing, AA. Lol. Well, thank you very much for that. It means so much. Machiavelli Sucks to Go says, whenever I talk about the Austrian painter, my phone says I have been using my phone too much. Yeah, it's probably true. Velda Shuck says, I had my classmate go onto Jerry Springer. He was told to use a fake name and the studio paid for his trip. The story he was giving was entirely false. So his classmate went on Jerry Springer and was given a fake story. So a lot of the show was stage managers, I'm sure you're aware. Or they were actors or people playing a role.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just like pro wrestling. Okay, I think that's it for Super Chats. Anything you'd like to promote before we get out of here?
I guess if you liked listening to me, I'm on Twitter at default_friend and Substack at defaultfriend.substack.com.
Yeah, I'm just seeing what you've got on your default wisdom. Your recent posts have been on the Hello Kitty girl, the pretty. I remember Hello Kitty was everywhere for a while.
Yeah.
Pretty ugly little liars. The search for authenticity was indistinguishable from a dog hunt for deceit. What do I mean when I say that politics are fandom? That's interesting. Do you think politics is fandom? Out of interest.
For a lot of people, not for everyone, but for a lot of people, yes.
Fandom of who? Like influencers they follow, or the two parties, or of like Donald Trump or?
I think mostly it's like influencers commanding little cults.
Yeah, I definitely do. You do see that. I've definitely been aware of it. Safety and containment for the truly unhinged. The internet is for porn. so there we go. All right. I will just remind people. I'm currently doing my spring sale on the academic agency. Promo code Mario Law.
スーパーマリオブラザーズ2は
I love that guy. I kind of I've dunked on weebs a lot, but I still have a soft spot for Japan in general. Yeah, join the channel. I've just put the last night's unpopular opinions on Substack of the podcast, and that's on iTunes as well now. But most importantly of all, ladies and gentlemen, get out.
What goes on in this town is none of your business.
As long as I'm living here, it is.
Then maybe you shouldn't be living here!
Well, that's easily fixed.